once to forgive the sins of the enemies, then to promise salvation to a repentant thief, and then to make provision for his mother's welfare. I highly doubt that most of his words were heard. I think the scene around the cross was rather loud and tumultuous. And then at noon, something very unusual happened. Literally, it silenced the crowd. God miraculously made midnight come to noonday, turned into darkness. It wasn't an eclipse, it was a miracle. Those 3 hours of darkness symbolized the judgment of God upon sin. I'd like to read for you a paragraph that I borrowed from John MacArthur, and I gave it to you in your notes. He said, darkness symbolizes divine wrath. Eternal wrath is about to be released, and darkness is everywhere. You could say it another way. God brought hell to Jerusalem that day. It is the darkness of God's judgment presence. So from noon to 3, hell came to Jerusalem and Judea. God showed up in wrath. God unleashed the full extent of his fury on Jesus Christ. In these 3 hours, Jesus suffered the eternal hell for all who would believe. So the darkness is not the absence of God. It is the opposite. It is the presence of God in full judgment, vengeance, and fury. Infinite wrath, moved by infinite righteousness, releases infinite punishment on the infinite Son, who can absorb an eternal hell, and for all who will ever believe, in 3 hours. These are the 3 hours of the wrath of God on him. 3 hours. 3 o'clock in the afternoon, the light returns. And that darkness on that land couldn't possibly compare to the darkness that was in the soul of Jesus. For 3 hours, he wrestles with the power of darkness. There are no words spoken for 3 hours. And I want you to feel the darkness. I want you to hear the silence. And then I want you to be able to say, Jesus understands my darkest times. He's the one friend that I can depend on to understand my darkest hours. And when heaven is silent, and God isn't saying anything to you, Jesus understands your darkest midnights, even at noonday. Jesus endured the spitting, he endured the scourging, he endured the beating, he endured the nails ripping through his skin and through his muscles, he endured dropping of the cross into that prepared hole. And when he had reached the fullness of his physical sufferings, he experienced the full brunt of the Father's punishment for our sin. And he cries out, my God, why have you forsaken me? Jesus descended into the essence of what hell is. He no longer has the presence of his Father. And he experiences what every person who dies without Jesus Christ will experience, and that is the absence of God forever. And I want us to look at these words, my God, why have you forsaken me? I want us to understand those words, and I want us to experience in some way what Christ did for us that day in those 3 hours. Point number 1 is the agony of unanswered prayer. When Jesus cried out, my God, why have you forsaken me? He was quoting Psalm 22. And most scholars believe that what was happening was Jesus was crying out, my God, why have you forsaken me? But all through his hanging on that cross, he was repeating Psalm 22 not only talks about an experience that David had, but it is a prophetic psalm about the Messiah and his crucifixion. And so Psalm 22 verse 1 says this, my God, why have you forsaken me? Why art thou so far from helping me? And from the words of my roaring, my God, I cry out by day, but you do not answer. You know, whatever Jesus was praying for while he hung there on the cross, we aren't told. Perhaps he was just asking for a token of the Father's love. Maybe to sense the Father smiling on him, being willing to be the sacrifice. Perhaps he was looking for the presence of God. Maybe he was looking for the strength of God to help him bear that suffering. But he didn't hear anything. Now, Jesus always was heard by the Father. Matter of fact, in John chapter 11, he says to the crowd, my Father hears me always. All the time my Father hears me. And that means he responds to my prayers. Even in Gethsemane, when Jesus was asking the Father to allow the cup to pass from him, it seems like the Father was being silent, but the Father was answering him, no, there is no other way. This is the way. You must bear the cup. But when Jesus submitted to his Father's will, as was his will to do, the Father sent angels to minister to Jesus and to strengthen him. So the Father was listening and hearing and responding, but now he doesn't even hear a no. He hears nothing. He receives nothing. Heaven is silent. And for Jesus, this is agony because his Father is not there to answer his prayers. You say, why? Well, as Jesus became our sin, as he bore our iniquity on his body while he hung there on that tree, his Father had to turn away. In Isaiah 59 verse 2 it says, your iniquities have made a separation between you and your God, and your sin hath hidden his face from you, that he does not hear. And when Jesus became our sin, all of our sin, every ounce of our sin, all the sin of all the world, of all the people who ever lived, who were living and ever would live, the Father said, that's it. And he turned his back on his Son. No wonder Jesus felt forsaken. That had never happened in all eternity. The second thing I want you to see is the agony of seemingly unbearable stress and distress. This stress and distress of suffering and becoming sin and having his Father turn his back and not hear his prayers overwhelms Jesus to a place where he roars out to his Father. Now, while he hangs on that cross, we don't hear these words, but these are the words of Psalm 22, verse 1. My God, why have you forsaken me? Why are you so far from helping me? And the words of my roaring. And I can just imagine inside of Jesus as he hangs here on the cross, experiencing the absence of his Father, that from inside comes this roaring scream of, Father, where are you? And I think most of us have seen that painting called The Scream. There's this, like it's a watercolor, and there's this guy standing there, and his face is elongated, and his hands are around his face, and his mouth is like this. And it's titled The Scream. The idea of the painting was to depict the scream due to stress that most humanity experiences at some point in time in their lives. And they cry out and they shriek and they roar because of the stress. This is on the human level. Can you imagine the roar and the cry of our Lord Jesus Christ? The cry from the bottomless pit as he's experiencing our hell for us. That perpetual shriek of those who are cast away from the presence of God forever. The roar of those who experience hell and are overwhelmed by the wrath of God. I would think that would be heaven-piercing, it would be hell-piercing, it would be incredible agony. Well, someone was trying to capture the agony of that moment, and he said it would be something like this. It'd be like a child falling down, cutting their knee badly, and running to their father who has always been there for them, and finding the father not there. But then seeing the father walking down the street, and running after their father, and crying out to their father, "Father, help me, help me, help me." And the father continues to walk away and ignores the cry of the child, and all of a sudden the father is no longer in sight and never comes back. And they sit down on the sidewalk and they cry and they scream and they wail and they sob because their dad is gone. Now, our hearts would break for a child like that. What Jesus experienced at that time, hanging on that cross for those last 3 hours, was excruciating stress and distress in the presence of a withholding and silent father who had abandoned him. I always wondered what the angels must have thought when they heard his cry out, my God, why have you forsaken me?" The surprise. This has never happened in all eternity. And then looking over at the father and seeing him stationary and unresponsive and turning his back on his son, what must they have thought? I asked a question as I was preparing. Would this frighten me? If I didn't know Christ as my Savior, this would frighten me. If you're here today and you don't know Christ as your Savior, you're not a follower of Christ, these will be your words if you remain an unbeliever. This is what you're going to experience. You're going to experience unbearable stress. You're going to experience God's wrath. You're going to experience abandonment. You're going to experience forsakenness, not just for 3 hours, but forever. And just as I needed to come to a Savior who was Jesus Christ, so must everyone in this room come to a Savior who is Jesus Christ. And I want to encourage you to reach out in faith today. Embrace him. Believe in him. Trust in him. So you can escape that hell. And that's why Jesus came. That's why Jesus died. The third thing I want you to see is the agony of unmitigated sinnership. You say there's no such word as sinnership. There is so. I looked it up in the dictionary. It talks about identification with sinners, okay? So unmitigated means complete, absolute, unqualified, and sinnership, identification with sinners. So Jesus, he is completely, absolutely identified with you and me. When he became our sin. Whatever you've done wrong, whatever you're going to do wrong, whatever anybody else has done wrong, he became that sin. All the sins of all the people, of all the ages, God put on his Son. And all the hell that they deserved for eternity, were laid on Jesus. But they were laid on Jesus, I can say, in a compressed manner. It was laid on him, and it was laid on him without the Father's support at all. If Jesus was just a man, he could never sustain that burden. He would have died before he could have said, "It is finished." Since Jesus' deity and Jesus' humanity, his sufferings carry infinite value in the presence of someone who is infinitely holy, who is his Father. Since since Jesus is infinite and the Father is infinite, that is how Jesus could bear justly, or our justly deserved hell. And he could do it in a compressed period of time because infinite God and infinite Son came together for that purpose. And he experienced all the wrath of all of our sin, and all of the hell of all of our sin in a compressed period of time. There was a picture in U.S. News and World Report back a few years ago of a man standing in front of the Sears Tower in Chicago. And the caption underneath the picture explained that some stars are so dense that if they were compressed to the size of the two boulders that the man was holding in both of his hands, that those boulders would weigh as much as the Sears Tower weighed. It's a faint picture of how God compressed upon his Son the agonies of his identification with sinners in a short period of time. All of our sin, all of the hurt and pain caused by those sins laid on Jesus, all the pain God's holiness felt when he saw the sins of all of us, not just the little sins, but also the huge sins, not just sins that hurt no one, but only broke God's laws, but sins that crushed the life out of other people. Dads walking away from their children, and wives rejecting their husbands, and people hurting others because they're too selfish to make the necessary changes, and leaders of nations causing wars in order to gain what isn't theirs, and the Holocaust, and murders, and the 6 million abortions in the United States of America, because people won't take responsibility for their own actions. You know, that's 10 times more innocent blood shed than was shed during the Holocaust. I want you to understand something. The Father made Jesus, who knew no sin, to be sin for us, that we might become the righteousness of God. The Father laid our sin on Jesus' body while he hung there on the cross, and Jesus experienced being the cursed one, the vile one, the foul one, the repulsive one, the one who was the object of dread. And with the entire weight of all the sins of all humanity crushing down on him, he cries out to God, Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani, which means, my God, why have you forsaken me? And it's really interesting, the word Eli is the name for God, but God being the strong one. So in the midst of feeling forsaken, in the midst of being abandoned, he cries out, my strong one, why have you abandoned me? Why have you left me here to bear it all myself? You're my strong one, where are you? He experienced utter abandonment, utter forsakenness. He received no help from his Father at all. Perhaps this will encourage us. When you are in the midst of a trial that overwhelms you, and you feel the silence of God, I want you to remember the words of Jesus that are spoken to us after his resurrection. He said, I will never leave you nor forsake you. I want you to understand that is written, that's spoken by a man who's been forsaken, who understands what it means to be forsaken. And he says to you and me, I will never leave you nor forsake you. Sometimes our sin will hide his face from us. Sometimes he will be silent when we pray. But the moment we repent, he's right there. fourth, I want you to see the agony of unassisted aloneness. Jesus endured an incomprehensible, inexplicable abandonment by God. He said, "Why have you forsaken me?" Which means, "Why have you deserted me? Why have you abandoned me?" And this was a brand new experience for Jesus that had never happened in all of eternity. Before he came into the world, he was the second person of the Godhead. He was the Son that was coming. And he never experienced anything but the love of his Father being lavishly poured out on him throughout all eternity. And even when he came down to the earth, he told his disciples in John 16, "A time is coming, in fact has come, when you will be scattered, each one to your own home. You will leave me all alone." And then he says, "Yet I will not be alone. My Father is with me." He says, he's experiencing his Father all the time. Even if he was the only one left in the world, he experienced his Father's presence with him while he was on the earth. He felt that oneness with the Father. When he was baptized, when John the Baptist baptized him, he heard a voice from heaven. "This is my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased." When he went up on the mountain and was transfigured, and the glory of God that resided inside him leaked out of his skin, and Peter and James and John saw the deity that they had been walking with, he heard a voice, "This is my beloved Son, hear ye him." When he went to Gethsemane, the Father heard his cries in Gethsemane and sent the angels to minister to him, to strengthen him for the journey that to the cross. When he got to the cross, he didn't hear, "This is my beloved Son." Did God send angels? No. Did God send a dove to lay on his shoulder? No. Did he hear, "Well done, good and faithful servant"? No. There was no grace, no favor bestowed, no comfort administered. The content of the cup that he prayed he would not have to do was not diminished in any shape or form. Instead of love, there was wrath. Instead of affection, there was coldness. Instead of nearness, there was distance, and it happened over a period of 3 hours. But I want you to understand something. The infinite God turning his back on his infinite Son. Those 3 hours were an eternity to the Father and the Son. The only presence of the Father was the bearing down on him with his wrath. Jesus feels and senses the abandonment and the forsakenness. There's not a kind look, there's not a kind word, there is no consolation, there's no comfort, there's no encouragement. He's totally alone, he's deserted, and he's forsaken. Boy, my God, why have you forsaken me? We call them human words, but no human, no son of Adam has ever been able to say, my God, why have you forsaken me?" And it had to be real. You may feel forsaken, but you're not forsaken. Even the most reprobate individual is not forsaken by God until the day he dies. But Jesus not only felt forsaken, Jesus was forsaken. I want you to understand this. When Jesus came into the world to pay the penalty for our sin, he endured all the physical pain and all the emotional pain. And when the weight of all the sin of all the world was laid on him, he endured his Father's presence being withdrawn. He endured our hell so that we wouldn't have to pay for the penalty of our sin ourselves. Now, I want you to remember this. Jesus loved his Father so much that even when the Father turned away from him and forsook him and abandoned him as he hung there on the cross, bearing the wrath of the Father, he continued stay on that cross. He continued to fulfill everything that was necessary so that he could say, it is finished. It's paid in full. No one else has to go to hell. All they need to do is put their trust in what God, my Father, was doing through Jesus Christ, our Savior, on that cross. You need to embrace him. You need to say, I'm going to follow you, Jesus. You paid it all for me. There's no sense in me paying it for myself. Thank you. Let's pray. Lord, I can't say thank you enough. I truly am thankful that you remind us of your sufferings, that we spend time once or twice a year looking at your death and your suffering there for us. And Lord, I thank you for communion that we're going to be partaking of. I want to thank you that we remember your body being broken for us when we take the bread, your blood being shed for us when we take the cup. We're so thankful for your death on the cross for us. We can't fully comprehend hell. We can't fully comprehend heaven. But we are so thankful that you were willing to come and endure the wrath, Jesus, of your Father for our sin. Thank you for paying it in full for us. And this morning, as we take the